I am very happy to introduce my colleague, Dr. Connie Kasari. Dr. Kasari is a professor here in the Department of Education and also in the Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Science. She's been a leader in developing randomized control trials for children with autism, and particularly in focusing on joint attention, but also in school-based interventions, parent-based interventions. She's one of the leading interventionists in autism in the world. We're very happy to have her today to talk about advances in intervention science, current evidence, and future directions. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Connie Kasari.
Good morning. So I'm actually not going to talk completely about my work. I'm going to sort of give you a broad overview of some of the current evidence in interventions, mostly early interventions today. So I'm going to really address 3 issues. One is that we have this huge research to practice gap. Another is that we don't have a single intervention that's most effective, and that we have issues with deployment and sustainability of intervention. So I'm going to try to hit all 3 of those topics generally. So I'm going to start by talking just a little bit about our local landscape in Los Angeles. First of all, Los Angeles Unified, where we do a lot of our research these days, is a huge district, right? It's the 2nd largest in the country. We have 14,000 students on the autism spectrum, or with that designation. The district as a whole is really diverse, but 75% of our kids are Hispanic, 80% are on free and reduced lunch, and only 9% of the district's population is white. Does that surprise you? No. Okay, good. So when we think about kids with autism, this is a portion of the data from the last 5 years. What we notice is that our Hispanic group of students with ASD is the fastest growing group, as you would expect. But white kids represent about 30% of kids with ASD compared to the regular population, which is 9%. When we look at service usage, so how many services do you have, OT, PT, etc., what we find is that white kids get the most and Hispanic kids get the least. Does that surprise you? No. Okay. So disparities are real, but we don't expect those in public schools. We expect that public schools are places where we don't see those kinds of disparities, and yet we have them. So I want to just think about, or have you think about, 3 different issues that we have. One is that we have a huge research to practice gap. So those of us in research institutions who do intervention research are not very good at translating those interventions into community practice. So let's consider most kids with ASD. So most have never been in a research study. And most interventions that have been developed for ASD have never been tested rigorously. So then when we think about, well, what is the evidence base for kids with ASD? Well, the current evidence base doesn't actually reflect most kids with autism. But we have a lot of programs, right? So we've had this proliferation of intervention programs, and most of them have these, initials, mostly 3 letters, PRT, DRI, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And some of these have been tested, but many of them have not been tested. So when we think about early interventions, which is where most of the intervention research has happened, so what's our evidence base? So we've had only 2 randomized controlled trials of a comprehensive intervention. So when we think about early interventions for kids with autism, we think, well, they need, a comprehensive intervention. We need to address a lot of different issues. So they get somewhere between 20 and 30 hours per week of interventions, behavioral interventions, as well as OT, PT, speech, etc. So only 2 studies have looked at the effects of a behavioral intervention. And the first one was published in 2000, so a while ago. It was on discrete trial training, which is a form of applied behavior analysis that requires repetition and, testing of different concepts, mostly pre-academic concepts, or trying to reduce challenging behaviors. And what we find is that when children start off in the beginning of about 50 IQ, so about half of what you would see on average, kids who get about 20 hours of this particular treatment make huge gains in IQ, about 16 points, compared to only 1 point for kids who are not getting that dose of that intervention. But the point here is that this is a very small sample. It's 28 kids. That means 14 kids in each group. But it's a 2-year-long study, so it takes a lot of resources. The other study is a similar study in that it combines the behavioral strategies with some developmental strategies. These kids are much younger. They're 2 years old as opposed to preschoolers. And again, we have a change after 2 years of 19 points in IQ compared to kids in the community who are not getting this dose or this intervention. Right? And again, that's a small study too. It's 48 kids, it's double, but it's still a small study. All right? So one of the problems we have in science generally is reproducibility of our findings. All right? So we get these effects in these original studies. They're oftentimes a small sample, but they oftentimes don't replicate, which is a problem for us. So when we think about the replications of these 2 intervention approaches, we find that the original DTT study by Tris Smith, who was here at UCLA, trained at UCLA, and now is at University of Rochester, his original study was significant at the 0.05 level, so it's barely significant. And the replication was by another group, even a smaller sample, 24 kids, and it wasn't significant. Now, when I say it wasn't significant between groups. It's not that kids didn't benefit. So they grew, but they grew at the same level, whether you were in the community group or whether you were in the intensive ABA group. The ESDM original study, again, was significant at 0.05. And the replication, which was twice as large, about 98 kids, has not been published but has been presented, was non-significant. Right? So it's a problem. Now let's just think about a couple of other interventions. This is one that I was involved in. It's called the Focused Playtime Intervention. It was one of Marian Sigmund's with one of her graduate students, Michael Siller. And when Marian got sick, I took over this. So I got involved in this particular study, but it was a very low intensity study. It was a parent-mediated intervention, mostly parent education. It was with high-risk infants, but they were 15 to about 30 months of age. It was on about 66 infants, and you can see that the children are, at the beginning, about 65 IQ, and they grow, again, about 18 points in about a year's time. But interestingly here, the control group who didn't get the intervention also grew about 14 points, so no difference, right? So they're both developing over time. Another model that's a naturalistic developmental behavioral intervention called CERTS, a similar kind of thing. These were toddlers, so they were very young. Children got 9 months of intervention. They either got just parent education or they got this hands-on CERTS model. And you can see there's no difference between the 2 groups in growing in IQ, only 6 points in 9 months. But look at where they start. They start at 75, which we would consider within the normal range of intellectual development. All right, so these are different intervention phases. The intervention phase for Marian's, the one that I was involved in, was only 3 months. So what do we make of those findings? So we have to think about what our outcome measures are and what the active ingredients are of an intervention. So the primary outcome has been IQ. It's interesting, right? But many factors can influence IQ. So we knew this from the 60s, right? When we started to think about how we could raise IQ in children from a lot of different backgrounds or with a lot of different disorders. In this case, you can't rule out the dose of intervention. So it may be just any kind of intervention, and hours of intervention matter for changing developmental courses. And the year of the study also matters. So the counterfactual, right? Because over time, community interventions have changed, right? We've had this shift in what's offered and what you'll see in school programs or what you'll see in the community. And so the fact that you don't get this reproducibility of findings may be because the field has changed, right? We can't replicate things when it's this shifting field. Also, while IQ is likely important, right? We all want to have a normal range in our IQ. We want to test higher, right? That's always the goal. It's not a core deficit of ASD. In fact, we know when we've done studies of large studies of 8-year-old children with autism, the majority of them, over half, 60 to 70%, function in the normal range of IQ. IQ is a very unstable measure in preschool. So we have to start to think about, well, what are the active ingredients that give benefit from an intervention? So there are lots of different things that we could consider. What we've mostly talked about are dose and teaching approach, right? An ABA approach, many hours of intervention. But there are some others that people have started to talk about, which is content. What is it that we're teaching? What is the active ingredient of those interventions? So our current focus has really been on these kind of core impairments, some of which I think you've already heard about this morning, around social communication, joint attention, those kinds of behaviors that really set children with autism apart from children that are typically developing or children with other developmental disorders. So restrictive, repetitive behaviors, including sensory now, and social communication. And to a large extent, these are independent of IQ, right? So you can be an adolescent with a high IQ, but still suffer from a lot of these core impairments. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about early core deficits in social communication. So we think about, with young kids, engagement with another person, play skills, and communication gestures like joint attention and language. So why focus on those? So we know that language, which is not a core deficit anymore of autism, even though many of our children are delayed in language early on, we know that language by the time that children are 5 or 6 is the best predictor of a good social outcome. And when I say language, it's not well defined, but it usually means phrase speech. Joint attention skills, so the ability to follow a point, the ability to share attention around some event or object, predicts to language. So young children with more joint attention skills have better language skills, both concurrently and as we look at them down the line, a year later, 5 years later. Play skills, especially around imaginative play or symbolic play, predicts to cognitive abilities. So these are really critical targets for early interventions. Evidence also suggests that the way in which you teach this matters, right? So our improvements in joint attention, play, and engagement vary depending on how we approach the teaching. And we're really focused on spontaneous child initiations, not just responses. So I'm going to show you a couple of video clips of 2 little boys. Both are 4 years of age. They were in one of our studies that was really focused on children who at age 4 still didn't have phrase speech. So they were slowly progressing in language, right? And it was a comparison of an ABA approach, discrete trial training, to one that we've developed here called Jasper, which is a naturalistic developmental intervention focused on core deficits. And both of these little boys did really well in the program, but I want to show you just the difference in the teaching method. So that we tested the kids in school in Los Angeles Unified. This first little boy is getting his play assessment in school.
Oh. What is it?
Okay, so what I want you to notice about him is that he's already using some joint attention, right? He has some nice skills. He doesn't have pretend play. That's a functional play. He's trying to feed the doll. And he has fewer than 5 words, so you heard milk, okay? All right, so let me show you what he looked like about 4 months into the intervention. And this is the discrete trial play program on symbolic play. So some of the actions are symbolic.
Answer phone. You got it. Do this. Pretend to be T-Rex. Yeah, bud. Good. Pretend focus piano. You are so smart. One more time. Pretend focus piano. Wow, it's working.
So that's modern day discrete trial without food reinforcers, social. Kid did well, kid was engaged. That's not play. Just FYI. So the book action is supposed to emphasize symbolic play, but it's more like work. And it comes from the adult, the idea comes from the adult, so it's not generative. And the problem we have then is now we have to program for generalization because it's really not something that is generated from him. So I think this is a great method for some outcomes that you're working on, some pre-academic skills, some matching skills. It's a good approach. But it's not an approach that's shown any evidence for changing some of these core deficits on joint attention and symbolic play, not real change. So I'm going to show you the other little boy who's also 4, and this is his play assessment at school. Okay, so he also had about 5 words. He shows, so that's a nice joint attention skill. So both these little guys had some emerging skills. And this is him about 4 months into his program, and he's in the library at school. So what you should notice is that the method, it combines developmental and behavioral strategies.
I see the titles. Where's the treasure? Let's find the treasure. Where's he is? Oh, there's the treasure. Ah! Oh, I got the money. Oh, I have money too. I got coins. You have coins. Oh, I have coins too. Yet you. Oh, I have so much treasure. Let's find it. Tiled in the birthday. I see a birthday. Everything smooth as spinning. Oh, cakey. Arg, say the pirates. Yeah, it gets you. Arg, say the pirates.
Okay.
It's your birthday. Yes, thanks. This one is the best.
Okay, it goes on and on and on. And in fact, somebody comes into the room and he points out to that person using, a joint attention gesture what he's doing. So a big difference in terms of what we're looking for and how we're getting there. All right. So that method is called Jasper, Joint Attention Symbolic Play Engagement Regulation, something we've been working on for the last 15 or 20 years. And it's one of these interventions that's really focused on the core deficits. So it's a module. It's not a comprehensive intervention. It doesn't take the place of all the other interventions a child has, but it's modular. It comes in and goes out depending on what the child's needs are. And it's within this class of interventions now that are considered ABA, but are a slight deviation in that they're more developmental. It's targeted, it's modular, it's short-term. Short-term in terms of our research. Of course, long-term sometimes in terms of what kids need. It's a layered intervention, so we're working on issues around engagement, around play, around joint attention, and around language. We've tested it now multiple times in multiple randomized trials with hundreds of kids, about 500 kids. Highly replicable, whether we use therapists to do it, teachers to do it, or parents. We get increases in joint engagement that's child-initiated, like the little boy you just watched. We get increases in play skills, functional play skills in young kids, symbolic play skills in preschoolers. And we get increases in joint attention. And when I say joint attention, I mean initiating joint attention, showing, pointing, engaging with the other person in an active way. So lots of papers that you can read if you have interest. Need a bedtime snooze. We've kind of shifted from just looking at community comparisons now to doing an active comparator. So we want to know, if we give you all the same information, can you do this? Or do we have to do the coaching, which is a lot more expensive? And what we find, there's Amanda, who you're going to hear next, on adults, however, even though she works mostly with babies and preschoolers and adults. She does it all. So we have compared Jasper doing hands-on coaching to giving parents parent education. Right, so we're just working with the parent one-on-one and talking about the kinds of things that they need to work on with their particular child. And what we find is that child-initiated joint engagement is much greater over entry to exit, which is about 3 months, and then it maintains to follow-up, which is 6 months. And the bottom line is, so this is information sharing, and this is hands-on coaching. And it's a larger sample, about 86 toddlers. All right, so it's only 20 sessions, 10 weeks. We get these increases, joint engagement, play diversity, so flexibility in play. Play level, so we're increasing the level of play. But what's interesting is when we do the group comparison, which is a one-on-one with the parent, on a stress reduction module, it actually does reduce parent stress. And we don't do that in Jasper. It doesn't increase, but it doesn't decrease. When we've done the same intervention and the same comparison with low-resourced families, this is a multi-site study across 5 sites in the country with about 112 kids, we find the same results. So in the home, this is preschoolers, we find child-initiated joint engagement is higher for the ones who get coaching versus those who just get parent information. So here, this is 24 sessions over 12 weeks. Again, increases in joint engagement, symbolic play, because the kids are older, and initiating joint attention. All right, so there's good evidence of improving these core deficits using Jasper, but also some other naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions, suggesting that the approach needs to be more developmental for these core deficits. So there's another study with another similar kind of approach where they focused on imitation, but what they got was improvements in initiating joint attention. Another one using the SERTS model where they collapse requesting and joint attention. So you can't tease that apart, but they got increases in social communication over a group that just got parent education. All right, so bottom line there is that we need to think about the kinds of intervention approach that we're using, but we also know that a single treatment isn't effective for all kids. And in fact, we don't have one single effective intervention. So when we think about subgroups of kids, so minimally verbal children do make the least amount of progress for most of our intervention studies. And there's a big concern for children who at age 5 still are not talking. All right? So we've only recently, in probably the last 5 years, started to really seriously address this issue in research studies. Before that, minimally verbal children were just excluded from studies. So we did a study that's now published on about 60 kids that were aged 5 to 8. So that's the window where we think we can get the biggest bang for the buck if you're not talking by age 5. So if you have fewer than 20 functional words, then that was our inclusion criteria. So as it turns out, children with autism who are minimally verbal tend not to have 0 words. There are kids like that, but it's a very small percentage of kids. Most kids have some words. They don't use them very frequently. They may not use them functionally. They may be scripted. But these kids had fewer than 20 that they were using functionally. And they'd already received 2 years of early intervention. And that was critical because we want to make sure children have had access to interventions if they're going to be included in the study. So we thought that because most of the children had had pretty basic ABA services, we wanted to add in something that they hadn't had. So we added in Jasper, and we combined with Jasper a behavioral language-based program called Enhanced Milieu Training. And it's really focused kind of on prompting and requesting and really trying to get kids to talk. So the combination of those two was what all kids in the study got. And then half of them also received a speech-generating augmentative system. So the question here is, will that help children either communicate or increase their spoken language? And it's a big debate because there are a lot of people that have a lot of opinions about when you give a child an augmentative system and when you don't. Whether you use PECs, whether you use a speech-generating device. So we started off using Dynavoxes, which were $7,000. And about halfway through the trial, iPads and software, Proloquo to go, became more available, and so we switched to that, which is a lot cheaper. It would be even cheaper if Proloquo was on a tablet, but they haven't done that yet. So the design was a little crazy because we didn't think that one treatment was going to be effective for all kids, or that the device added into the treatment was going to work. And so half of the kids got the device and half did not. And then after 3 months, we determined who was responding based on certain criteria. So if you were a fast responder, you just stayed the course. But if you were a slow responder, those were the ones we were really interested in, then if you had the device, you just got increased intensity, 3 sessions per week instead of 2. If you were a slow responder and you hadn't had the device, you could either get the device or you could increase intensity. So this is called a sequential multiple assignment randomized trial. It's a pretty crazy design, but it allows us to determine, is it better to give that device right from the beginning or later on? Well, what we found was that if you got the device right from the beginning, you had this huge jump over the first 12 weeks in spoken, socially related communication, right? That continued after we added in parent training or did not here. Well, actually, all parents got parent training, so that continued. It drops off as we do the follow-up, in part because not all kids left with a device. Not all kids also need a device. That's another sort of point of this. It was just adding in the device made a big difference. These kids who got the behavioral treatment are growing over time, but much slower. The other interesting thing is the same results were found for novel new words. So you got the device, many more novel new words, and you were commenting more, which is joint attention language. So I'm going to show you a quick video of just a child from session 1 to session at 3 months, just to give you an idea. And this little guy is pretty interesting because he's 5.5 and he has 0 words, no sounds, nothing. And he has the Dynavoxes early on.
Let. Want both or blocks? Both on. Green. Sorry? No, green.
Colors, blue.
Oh, you want a blue back.
Boats. Drive.
Drive boats.
All right, so he's a little squeaky because he hasn't used his voice in 5.5 years, but he left with about 300 approximated words, left with an iPad, is really much more using spoken language now. He's a kid who needed access to communication. He also could program the Dynavox within 5 sessions. He could read, he was smart, really smart. So I think access to communication is the key here for kids that are at this particular age or any older age. But even younger kids can benefit. So I'm going to show you a little boy who is pre-verbal because he's a preschooler. So he's not minimally verbal yet. He's pre-verbal. He's 3, and the first day that we assessed him, he cried through all of the assessment. So this is day 1 of us trying to do Jasper with him. And you can see how unhappy he is, right? Play is supposed to be fun, right? He's not having fun. Let's see. Right, so got some restricted interest there. Doesn't want you to move the toy. Very typical of what we see in our little guys. This is day 2, the second day. So we assessed this, we had a plan, and you will see him now with an iPad. Now he knows an iPad, he plays a lot of games on them, but the way we have it, of course, we're modeling on the iPad and we have locked out YouTube. All right, 6 buttons, uses it right away, can put 2 buttons together. This child needed access to communication. He now uses his iPad all the time, has, 80, I think, buttons on there that he can navigate through. He also uses some spoken words, but he still needs that iPad to communicate. So I would start it much younger. The last one I'm not going to show you just in the interest of time, but he is actually saying the word ball, and he has a little smile. So happiness, because it's play, and using words is important. All right. So the third issue is that deployment, of these kind of interventions can be really limited and sustainability poor in the community. And we have to be concerned about that. We have to work much harder at addressing this issue. So we have done a couple of studies in deploying Jasper into preschools. And Stephanie Shire and Yachi Chang are graduate students and now, former graduate students of mine who have really taken this work to fruition. In the New York toddler program, we had a train-the-trainer model where we deployed the treatment via a trainer through to paraeducators or paraprofessionals. Each toddler has a one-on-one paraprofessional from the community. It's 100% minority community in New York. And in the Los Angeles preschool deployment, LAPD, we like those terms, we fit the intervention into that existing structure of preschool programs that they had at the time. The system has shifted now, but at that time they had these preschool programs that had centers, and children just rotated through the centers, and Jasper went into one of the play centers. So these are some of the findings from the New York site. The LA one is published, the New York one is under review. But these are the data from there, where with Jasper, now all these kids are getting an ABA-based program, and so that we just compared a half an hour of Jasper every day to a socialization group that was their typical group. And what you find is that child-initiated joint engagement is much greater for kids who get Jasper after 3 months, right, compared to the waitlist group. The same thing with nonverbal gestures, and they're high level, so the showing and pointing, much better than in the group that's just getting socialization. And we also got a change in language. So in putting words together in these little toddlers, what's much greater for this group than this group. And it's about 120 little toddlers. And there's materials that we give out to the teachers. We have multiple studies going on currently in various places. All right. So my conclusions then are that interventions are really complicated. Their success really depends on context, individual differences, including the age at which you're trying to implement this intervention, the abilities of the child, and the willingness of the adults. So part of our issue has always been in deploying interventions is whether folks are ready to uptake them, whether they really do want to learn, right? And then secondly, the methods that we use to try to change the environment. We also know that more than one kind of intervention can work, right? Children often need a sequence of intervention or multiple interventions. It's not true that children get confused by different approaches. They're really much smarter than we as adults are in our approach to teaching sometimes. And then we just need to work harder to make interventions work in the community. So we need to be probably starting in the community with our treatments rather than trying to move them from the lab with a lot of controls into the community, but rather just starting there from the beginning. All right, thank you. This appreciation to all my lab folks. If you want more information just on what other kinds of projects we might be working on, the airbnetwork.org or Kasari Lab. Oops, and that's it. Whoops.